Good evening, everybody. My name is David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Center, and it's my very pleasant opportunity to welcome you all here today to our roundtable. It's going to be chaired by Richard MacGregor from the Lowy Institute. And before we begin our meeting, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are all in Australia, recognizing their continuing connection to land, water, and culture, and paying my and our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Over to you, Richard, please.
Thank you very much, David, and welcome to this event. To give it its full name in all its glory, on the 6th Plenum of the 19th Central Committee and its adoption of the resolution of the CPC Central Committee on the major achievements and historical experience of the party over the past century. I can assure you that is the last time I'm going to say that. I'll be moderating this discussion with three distinguished panelists, all from Sydney University. Chen Ming Lu, a senior lecturer in the Department of Government and International Relations. Hans Heinrichs, a professor of Chinese Business and Government and International Relations, Management and at the Business School. And David Goodman, a professor of Chinese politics, and as he said, the director of the Chinese Studies Center. Now, before we get underway, you'll see a box down the bottom of the Zoom screen for a Q&A. If you'd like to bang a few questions in there, hopefully we'll come to some of them, a selection of them in the last 15 to 20 minutes of the session. So the adoption of the historical resolution comes about a year ahead of the once every 5 years party congress at the end of next year, which is, of course, is expected to give Xi Jinping a third term in office. And in the process, of course, upending what had been considered the emerging convention in elite politics in China, in which each leader gets 2 5-year terms. But why an historical resolution as a precursor to the party congress? This is unusual of itself. The CCP has only twice before adopted resolutions on its history. So Ming Lu, let's start with you. Why an historical resolution and what does it mean?
Richard, thank you for the introduction. I hear my voice echoing. Anyways, my short answer is this document is issued for its timing because this is 2021. That's 100 years after the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party. So if there is any tradition that we could talk about here of the Chinese Communist Party issuing this important historical documents, I would say the tradition is to issue these documents at critical moments of the Communist Party's history. So the previous 2 documents really were issued as important moments of the Communist Party's history. The first one under Mao was issued in 1945. That was at the 7th Plenum of the 6th Party Congress. I think that was the time when Mao was really consolidating his power after being marginalized in the Chinese Communist Party's leadership for about 2 decades. Then the second such document was issued in 1981. That was 3 years after the economic reform and opening started at the 6th Plenum of the 11th Party Congress. Another critical moment, right? This is the time that Deng Xiaoping had consolidated his power. And this is the time that he really needed an opportunity to confirm the new guideline, economic reform and opening. And now the third such document, I don't see otherwise other than the 100 years memorial of the party's establishment. I don't really see another kind of justification for its release. We could say it's released because the 20th Party Congress is going to meet next year, but I think it has less to do than that, other than the 100 years, 100 years after the establishment of the Chinese Communist Party itself.
I guess it must have something to do with Xi Jinping as well, right? I mean, the document itself is about the new era. So what does it mean for Xi?
I think what it means for Xi is similar to what it had meant for Mao and Deng. This is a document that really signifies his position in the party has been consolidated. Not that his rule was under threat or anything, but this is really the document that officially justifies his consolidation of power. I don't really, if people have a close read of this document, I don't think it really has anything in it that talks about the terms of the leadership. So maybe this could be setting the ground for a third term of 5 years, but this tradition.
You're only saying maybe there. You're not so confident there's a third term coming up. I think it's wise to be always say maybe or perhaps, but it's you do expect him to have a third term from the end of next year.
I do expect him to have a third term, but I don't see it as a direct result of this particular document. I don't see this document justifying this. And I think when the Constitution was changed a few years ago, that was a clear sign of that. But the Constitution really was about the term that the president of the state could serve. Again, that's an honorary position that really doesn't hold any real power. As we know, the power resides within the party, and actually party leader has never had been subject to any limited number of terms.
Mm. Now we'll come back to Xi. Hans, let me come to you now. There's lots of the CCP speak or jargon in the resolution about the 4 consciousnesses, the 4 self-confidences, the 2 maintains, which I think is probably the most important one. But what about you? What did you pick up from it and in sort of decoding some of the language in there? You're muted.
Thank you, Richard. That is a very good question, because having worked as an interpreter for Chinese leaders in my youth at some stage, the question of translation is really a painful one. And spending decades reading Chinese documents, I think you start to get a grasp of it in some way. And I guess what you know is that you will not be able to understand the document if you just read it. You will have to strip away a whole lot of things to get to the core of it. What I also know is that these documents always do in fact have a core. Sometimes the core is even in a separate document that you're never going to see, that explains what is really meant, and the rest is public explanation and a kind of jargonistic camouflage around it. And I've looked at the document in that sense, and what I try to come up with is a way to strip it really down to its core. And I've been helped by Xi Jinping. There are 3 different versions of not different versions, but 3 type documents on the resolution. One is the full text of the resolution. One is the communique on the revolution, which brings it down and shortens it quite dramatically. And the final shortest one is the explanation that Xi Jinping has given in front of the plenum, introducing the resolution, which is again compressing the resolution. And what I was trying to look at is actually what are the core elements. And there's 2 quotes from Xi Jinping in his explanation to the Central Committee, where he mentions two subheadings. He says one subheading is on the historical significance of the party endeavor of the past century, and that provides what he calls comprehensive, in-depth and systematic summary of the party's historic contribution to China and humanity, they call it. So in brief, that is a section which addresses China in its relation to the world. And he has a similar subheading, which is historical experience of the party's endeavors and so on. And that highlights the importance of the document for the party. I've looked through those. The second one with the importance for the party has 10 lessons on what the party has to do, has to be standing on its own feet and has to be independent and has to follow the Chinese path. That's not so relevant. But what I found interesting, and I made a bit of an effort to translate that, is the subheading that addresses the lessons or the message for China and the humanity, and that has 5 points. And these 5 points, I thought, would have been, again, this is going back to my early life as an interpreter, this would have been something that a person like a prime minister or leader of the state would have been able to take to his meeting, his summit meeting with Joe Biden, which was only a few days after. And trying to read that in a way that would have been presentable, I think what he tries to do, and I think in a sense it is rather defensive, to explain the position of China in a literally quite common sense way. What he argues is point number one, China has emancipated itself politically and socially. The points he makes there is that China has basically overcome its colonial past and has now socially emancipated in itself by having the Chinese people becoming masters of their fate and seeing their aspirations for a better life becoming a reality. So that's the living standard. China has arrived. It is a country that's no longer living in its colonial past. The second point relates to the technological emancipation, not a point that is really that relevant for us, but it is a point that literally has 100-year and more history in the way in which China sees itself regarding the West, the ability to absorb technology. And that again is quite clearly stated. China completed the process of industrialization that took developed countries centuries in a mere number of decades. Right. So China really has arrived technologically. So China is there. The third point he makes is, I think that's clad very much in Marxist terms, that but what he says is Marxism in China is people-centered, practical, open-ended, and of contemporary relevance. I would read that as a statement that essentially is negating the neoliberal experience and the neoliberal predominance of our economic discourse, to say what we have is different, but it's practical and it works for people. And from that, he goes on to say, that's point number 4, China is a potential model for developing countries. So he does not go into the competition with Western countries or being superior, but he says the party is creating a new model for advancement and expanding the channels for developing countries to achieve modernization. Quite an humble position to say we are an alternative that developing countries could consider. So it's not we know better and you have to copy us, but we are just an alternative model. And the final point he makes there is to say the party as a driver of this development has preserved its integrity and is improving its government and leadership capacity. So that's, I think I read that as saying the party actually has a role. It's not an ideological imposition, but it is a pragmatic organization that actually can make these achievements that he's outlined before. Okay. So if that's the gist, I think it's quite a clear message, and it explains a whole range of points where China is certainly under pressure at the moment to explain where it stands and what he wants to do.
Okay.
So from that,
yeah, let me pull you up there because we'll come back to some of those points. I think there's a bit of common prosperity in there. There's a bit of the China solution. I was very interested in what you said about the defensiveness, but I will come back to that. I want to go to David now. David, we're talking a lot about the political dimension. That might seem distant from many people's lives. Give us a sense of where this fits into the broader society and perhaps the party's legitimacy.
I think it's all about legitimacy, really. I've got three basic points to make. One about presentation, one about purpose, and one about prospects. So let's start off with the presentation. This resolution, as Minglu and other people have said, doesn't really live up to expectations. The expectations of the Western press before the sixth plenum that Xi Jinping was going to be presented as the new emperor just isn't there. It's not in the resolution and it's not in the behavior at the plenum. On the whole, you read the resolution, you wonder, what on earth is this about? Both in the recent past and the more distant past, the contents are there already from the resolution. So why do you need a resolution? In 1945 and 1981, there was a dramatic shift in legitimacy or claim to legitimacy for the party. But that's not going on now. On the surface, all you've got here in the resolution is a fairly normal ideological statement of the kind that every sixth plenum that we've had since 1978 has delivered. So what's going on? So that leads to the purpose. The challenge, I think, is actually future change, especially as China tries to move up the economic value chain. There used to be an old joke in the Soviet Union, which was the future is certain, only the past is unpredictable. Some of you will remember that. What's new in this resolution is that that has actually been turned around completely. There are over and over again in this resolution, what is actually new is the statement that the future is unpredictable. I'll quote you just one, but there are several. There are many risks and challenges on the journey ahead, some of which we can foresee and others we cannot. To the life of me, that's the first time I can remember a communist party. And, like many people who became China studies people, academics, I came out of communist studies. That's the first time I can remember something like that. The main function, I think, of this resolution is to maintain and ensure the legitimacy of the party, no matter what, no matter what. Xi Jinping's role in that is secondary to the matter of the party being dominant.
So was he in that respect preparing people for difficulties ahead?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying. The resolution says having the courage to reform itself is a hallmark that distinguishes the Communist Party of China from other political parties. And it says that once, twice, three times. That's a lot. It's very, I think, rather unusual. So what is the prospect then for what's being proposed here? Now, some of the things that are being proposed in the resolution, Hans has dealt with. So party leadership, loyal, upright officials, ideological conformity, economic development. Really interesting. This is a party which claims allegiance to Marxist ideology. So we all know it's Marxist ideology as adapted to China. And it talks about principal contradictions. It has done since the 1920s, the Communist Party of China. What is the principal contradiction now? The principal, this is the resolution, not once again, but several times. The principal contradiction facing Chinese society is that between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. That's not quite the same as a commitment to consumer society, but it's not far off it, particularly when you ally it to the kinds of technological upscaling that is also part of the recipe. Another part of the recipe, which is, I think, Hans has alluded to a bit, is the notion of the Chinese path to development. And I found that very interesting. There's a section headed Following the Chinese Path, which starts off very poetically. May I read the sentence? The direction determines the path, and the path determines the future. Those of you with a deep reading of Chinese philosophers in the recent past will know some elements of that, I'm sure. So the struggle is now for the future. What are the prospects for that future to come about? Well, Steve Zhang, who's at SOAS, and Olivia Chung, who's also there now, they've just published an article in Third World Quarterly about Xi Jinping thought, actually, but it reads well as a guide to what the resolution is all about. And, you know, because it's a recipe for the future. It's well worth reading. I don't agree with all of it, but I think a lot of it makes a lot of sense. He's talking about consultative Leninism and so on and so forth. And, you know, he and they argue that this is a good recipe in the short term, but it has problems perhaps of being brittle in the long term.
Okay.
They point to 4 points: the end to collective leadership, the end to predictable and orderly succession, a more statist approach to managing the economy, and less pragmatism in global affairs. It's a strong argument, which of course is why it's an interesting article. But all 4 of those points are essentially contested and may not be the case. I would say that the biggest dangers are twofold. The first is how to ensure economic growth, technological development, and innovation within a one-party state. The second one is how to ensure that you don't have more leadership instability than necessary. I think the point that Minglu's hesitancy about saying that Xi Jinping will get a third term is not unserious, as it were. You start messing around with the rules that people like, and people say things like, well, hang on a minute, aren't you the morally upstanding leader who told us corruption's a bad thing? Now, the two things are different. But what's in here, what's in the resolution, is actually strong leadership, again and again. It's not necessarily the strong leadership of Xi Jinping, but it is strong leadership of the party. Yes, well, you do risk that if you mess around with the rules.
Let me pull you up on that point. That's a good theme on which to go back to you, Minglu, and both you and your cat can answer the next question. Yeah, well, we were talking before. I was underwhelmed by reading the historical resolution, I think as you were as well. It struck me as a kind of glorified work report of the kind that could be delivered at the Congress next year, you know, a forward laundry list of policies. And in that respect, to pick up on the theme that David was talking about, leadership, it was quite defensive. Do you see this as a defensive document of the leadership in that respect, or is it confident? We keep hearing how confident China is compared to the West. How do you assess it in that respect?
I think to understand the significance of this very document, we need to read it in comparison with the previous 2 historical resolutions. I think there is a question in the Q&A from Injie asking why is this one so short about the past? I think because the function of this historical resolution is different. I feel the first and the second historical resolutions under Mao and under Deng, they were really critical reflection of the party or of the great leader of the party's past. But this one kind of does the same thing, but from a different way. The critical perspective is pretty much lost in this document here. I was talking about this with David earlier today. David published an article in 1981 about the second historical resolution. David described this document as look back in anger. I think the first historical resolution looks back in even greater anger. Both of them really, they functioned to kind of provide this justification of a departure from the past. So there was a lot of criticism included in both the previous two documents. Whereas the third historical resolution also looks back at the past, but not in great anger. Instead, I feel it is looking back in appreciation. So it's just, I think the purpose here is to strengthen this, coming back to the previous point on legitimacy of the party and legitimacy of the leader of the party. The right to rule comes not from any severe power struggle within the party. It didn't come from experiences during revolution. It came from this historical heritage. That is why this party talks about the past, but didn't spend a lot of the content talking about the past. And it talks about the past with this level of appreciation. It confirms the conclusions of the previous two resolutions. This is a very important continuity.
So if it doesn't, I like that phrase, if this document does not look back in anger, but looks back more at with a touch of self-congratulation, does that display confidence to you, or is it, overconfident?
It is a kind of, I feel it's a confident, and it's a necessary kind of a confidence booster. So this continuity from the past, there is no breach, right? This reflection of the past didn't criticize anyone. It confirmed actually every great leader's achievement. This is I feel is a necessary confidence that we need now for particularly this leader. Also, it could be interpreted as maybe a lack of authority to be critical.
Right. Interesting. Hans, let me go to you and some of the points that you made about the economy. And I think in the 5 points that you listed, there was our system works essentially. And you also talked about the theme of common prosperity in not so many words. We've seen a big crackdown on aspects of the private sector in China recently, the party going into the private sector. The economy, as David said, is one of the big issues going forward for the party, for their legitimacy and their stature and their power in the world. Does this document say to you anything about the economy?
That's an interesting point, because in the summary, actually, the role of the economy was very much downplayed in terms of its practical aspects. It was the achievement overall that economic development has been achieved, but the challenges are not in the summary. But I think the whole document is, in fact, a long list of challenges, and you could see it that way in a number of areas. One of them certainly is the economy. And what he does in the document is, in fact, not a triumphant presentation of what has been achieved. I think there's always a triumphant bit somewhere to have the overarching impetus of the document to say that we're doing everything well. But if you read the document as a list of responses to potential challenges, then you get a whole lot of points where you would say, wait, as David said, there are points there where you said, well, this has never been in a party document. And he's making a number of points there. On the economy, well, the section that deals with economic development, he makes quite a strong point to say that the GDP growth actually is not a purpose in itself, but GDP growth is really to enable the primary driver, which is innovation, and then to go on that without that, the economy will be in trouble. So it's not triumphant. It's a point where he says, well, actually, we have to change the way we run the economy, and that spreads out in a number of more specific economic challenges. I think one of them certainly is the socioeconomic challenge of inequality. And I think from the document, you can, in fact, identify constituencies that had to be somehow satisfied. I mean, not for nothing, they mentioned that the resolution went really only through and was finalized after 547 amendments had been considered. So there will have been lots of complaints among those amendments, and it would really be fun to see the original version to see what has happened in the meantime.
Can I interrupt? That's 540 amendments offered through the Central Committee editing process, correct?
Yes, 547 to be precise. Yes. So there would have been a lot of feedback, and I think at some you can guess, and I think that's where you can identify different constituencies. There certainly is the inequality constituency that would argue we are not addressing that. So, and that would most likely be a constituency that is, in fact, that has problems with the current economic course of allowing privatization, of allowing reduction of social services coming out of the state sector. You have a constituency in terms of the growth model, that the growth model has to move away from GDP growth towards more innovation. You have, at the same time, in the deepening reform and opening up sections, you have statements that say we must open up, we must do everything, but at the same time, we have to keep going on with these trials. That's something where there have been discussions for a long time inside China, that the whole trial and pilot project is far too cumbersome and keeps the country from making major steps. So that probably would have been a constituency on the other side. And then something which I found really interesting is the legal constituency. That's something that is very quickly overlooked. But if you look at the first resolution, the word law was mentioned once in terms of the Marxist law of revolution. In the second, it was mentioned 4 times with the Marxist law and criminal law. In this revolution, the word law is mentioned 22 times, and mainly in the context of law-based governance and law-based exercise of state power. So there would have been a strong constituency that's on 2 sides, on the state side and on the, essentially, I think what comes from the private sector, on private interests to say, we need more guarantees for our interest.
Yes.
It's not a democratic or bourgeois revolution, but it's certainly a concession to an economic constituency.
Yeah, I think let's move on at that point, but I think that's a very good point about the rule of law, actually. David, I want to come to you now. Since you have written about this in the past, as Ming Lu said, as you mentioned, there was a big build-up in the press beforehand that Xi Jinping was going to sort of damn his predecessors, and particularly Deng. But look back in anger, maybe not. Look back with a bit of lack of self-criticism, maybe not. But there was a little bit of looking back in disappointment at the Hu and Jiang periods. Things that got slack and the like. What did you make of that? I mean, and also, did he downgrade the Deng period at all?
To be honest, I don't agree with those assessments on either his 2 immediate predecessors or on Deng Xiaoping. I think, for me, as I said, maybe not at great enough length, but the legitimacy of party rule rests on 3 things. One is the equation of the party with the people with China, which is something we've come to know and expect. It's been there for a long time. The second is that leadership has made mistakes in the past and still kept its commitment to the people and China. And the third one is that most important of all the commitments that it's made is the raising of standards of living and economic prosperity. And whatever went wrong with either under his rule or under anybody else's rule, that's taken care of by admitting those mistakes. Now, I would hazard a guess that there would be those in his group of supporters within the collective leadership who would like to have had a harder go on issues of corruption and so on, against some of the mistakes that one or two, possibly just one of his predecessors had not done anything about. He's been very big, as you know, against corruption and so on. So I would hazard a guess, but my guess is that amongst those 500 plus amendments, that's where the discussions went that way. Legitimacy is, of a one-party state is difficult to shake, as we know, and largely they implode from within rather than being overthrown. So if you can keep the elite together, if you can keep the rulers together, you can achieve longevity. That would be the message from both former Communist Party states and other authoritarian states in the world. It's the split in the elite which becomes difficult. And one thing we've learned from the Communist Party of China is that they've done a good job of keeping the elite together. Any sniff of somebody stepping out of line, and there's a clampdown on that person. It's going to be interesting to see who, if anything happens in terms of the leaking, for example, of the Xinjiang papers, which are rumored to have come from a senior official. You know, that's a break in the ranks of something we've not seen for a long, long time.
Yes, that's very interesting. And of course, there's the controversy about the Xinjiang papers and why the New York Times didn't publish more of them. And one of the reasons they gave was to protect the source, which I believe was absolutely true in their case. Minglu, let me come to you now. One thing that I noticed in the historical resolution, the first thing about challenges in the new era that the document mentioned was external challenges. In other words, I guess, the contest with the West, but really the United States. What did you make of how, you know, China's contest with the US and the West? What did you make of how that was treated in the document?
I feel this document is about many things, right? It's about the past, it's about the future, it's about modern Chinese nationalism and how, sorry about my cat, how it rose. Then I see it as a continuity of the narrative which has existed for a long time. The external, we versus them, this divide has existed for a very long time, since the Mao era. I just see it as a continuity. This is the very nature of Chinese nationalism. It's not necessarily just we as a nation were better than some other nations. It has another element to it, is we as a nation, we have been victimized by other nations as well. So I think this has to be strengthened and emphasized here in this document. Then it leads back to the previous point on the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy, where there are many ways to achieve or strengthen this legitimacy. One is performance, one is an emphasis on ideology. But nationalism could be part of it, yeah.
The external challenge, you don't think the document had a sense of this becoming more intense as China becomes more powerful?
I think you're right? I think if there is, I talked a lot about continuity. I think there is probably something new to this document, which is China is in a different position. China is more powerful, China is wealthier, more powerful. Yes. So China's position in the world has changed compared to what it was in 1945, what it was in 1981. So yes. I agree with you.
Hans, let me come to you. It was fascinating what you were talking about, the amendments, I thought, the 547 amendments and any insight into the drafting process, like intra-party democracy, so-called. We have one question here from one of the viewers. Any comments on the length of the resolution? Less than half of it is about the first 90 years and more than half is the past 10 years. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there's there's a good reason. If you couldn't really justify the revolution if you were not talking at length about the historical stages that the Communist Party went through, because the main impetus of the resolution in that sense is really to say both parts belong together. You can't negate the first period in the People's Republic with the second period, and you can't negate the second period, the reform period, by referring back to the more revolutionary period. So I think that had to be explained, and that takes a lot of space. I think that's one part. The other part is that somehow what I think Xi Jinping is trying to put down here is a party history orthodoxy, things you have to know and things you have to believe in. So it's a bit of historiography. These are the historical elements that we need to understand the party. I don't think they do make much sense for any practical purposes, but obviously this is...
I think we're losing Hans for a second there. He's frozen. While he's frozen, David, you can still hear me, I think.
Can you?
Yes. I want to, we talk about elite politics in China. You don't really talk about that in Australia, or democracies are in the same way. And you were making the point earlier that, the biggest game in town is keeping the elite together. And when people transgress the sort of internal or unwritten rules, they can be wiped out pretty quickly. And of course, Xi has wiped out a lot of people as he's tightened up those rules. But beyond, is it worth looking at this document at all beyond what it says to elite politics? Is what it says to, the broader Chinese population, societal impacts, is that important at all? Or is it simply a policy-making template which the rest of China will come to experience later?
It's a very interesting question, that, and I was wondering about it in preparing remarks for this. In a sense, this does speak to the entire Chinese population, which is odd because, after all, it's an internal party matter. This is a resolution on party history for the Communist Party of China. So we're not surprised by that because of the equation of the people with China with the party. So that's the answer to that question. So there will be no doubt that many of the messages that are in here go out to through schools, through social institutions, through the media all the time. Yes. Are there messages here for the elite? Yes, there are. Pretty much along the lines of Scott Morrison. Disunity is death. We need a strong leadership, united, loyal. Loyalty comes up frequently when it's talking about recruiting the new people who are going to be brought in to the leadership. Xi Jinping, after all, is not a young man. And in the normal way of things, he would have retired. So we can expect him, he gets good healthcare and all that, he'll go on living, he may even take a third term, of course. But generally speaking, there is generational change coming. And that generational change needs loyal people who understand both the constants that are being provided here in the document, in the resolution, but also the fact that the resolution is telling us there will not be constants and there will be things which will be unpredictable. That's a difficult thing to manage, I think, for anybody. But at the bottom line of all that is we do, I suppose, the old principle of democratic centralism. We discuss within the party until we're sure of what the line is, and then we agree it and we implement it. Now, it doesn't always work that way, as we all know.
I just wonder whether the notion, actually, let me pose the same question in a different way to you, Ming Lu. This is elite politics. What's your sense of how it spreads into the sort of broader population and the like? Do people take notice of this? Do they, sit up at night like they do before the budget or something? Actually, maybe people in Australia don't do that anymore. How do you think the message here is gradually received outside of the elite?
I can't really imagine. I feel probably people wouldn't notice too much a difference, really. David talked a lot about the unpredictable future. The future might be unpredictable, but I think the solutions are quite predictable. So, because it's all mentioned in this document, I have listed a few of them, right? So, economic reform, institutionalization of the party's rule, legal reform, democratization, a continuation of nationalistic or patriotic education. It talks about equity and equality. It talks about how the medical care system needs to be reformed. It talks about how the environment needs to be protected, so on and so forth. National defense is important, but this is something we have been hearing for a long time. National defense, the significance of it is actually really started under Mao already, right? The three rural issues even gained a mention in this document. Regional development, it talks about Western development program, it talks about Northeastern revitalization, it talks about one country, two systems. I think just really, I feel it's a kind of a combination or comprehensive presentation of all the past solutions now put together as a package for the unpredictable future. The future, again, as I said, I feel the future is unpredictable, but the measures to be taken are quite predictable.
Well, yes and no, if I can interrupt.
Go for it. Yep, go for it.
Because, and I'm not, not really arguing with Mingla, but the resolution says the market plays the decisive role in resource allocation. It also says, of course, that the government has to play a strong role. But it does say, now we've heard that line since the third plenum of the previous party congress. So
I think we heard the market playing a decisive role back in 2013. Maybe yes, that was the plenum. And people took that to mean, wow, things are opening up. But of course, it didn't unfold like that.
It didn't unfold like that. And that's my point. So whilst the recipes are there, what they actually mean in practice is the unpredictability. And it's bound to be. It's bound to be. This is a big moving from being a lower middle income country to a more high-tech, high-income country, or more higher-income country. That's going to be a big jump and take a lot of resources and a lot of direction. You can understand the mentality which says we need strong leadership to do that. At the same time, you have to know what the policies are. And I think there's a lot of policy bereftness. There was a question in the Q&A about can common prosperity be achieved? The answer is, if we knew what the policy of common prosperity actually amounted to, we could answer the question. It's a policy, it's a very vague policy goal.
I did see that question about the question in the question box was, do you think, common prosperity can be achieved? I saw that there and I thought, well, gosh, I don't know whether I'll ask that because it's impossible to say. So, it's like the economy in a small country next year, let alone one the size of China. But let me go. So keep the questions coming in the question box if you do have something. I'll ask one of either of you can start with this. To what extent is the resolution the characterization of the PRC 3.0 in the sense that Mao enabled China to stand up, Deng made China richer, and Xi is making China strong? Now that's become a bit of a cliche. Ming, you go first. Is that accurate or is it an oversimplification?
I feel I agree with this, Bill. I feel this really is, if there's anything that is new to be included in this document, is really like what is missing, what has been missing in the previous two historical resolutions is the restoration of the past glory, national rejuvenization, which should be achieved from now on in the new era. So I think I agree with this comment.
David, a different question for you that Hans is not here, but I asked Ming before about the external threat, but the other external issue, if you like, is the so-called China solution and lessons for developing countries. China as a model. Obviously, you cannot export the Chinese model lock, stock, and barrel, but you might be able to export, aspects of it. Particularly, well, it could be to any countries actually, but they talk about developing countries. Did you get much out of that? This is a theme of recent years, the China solution. Did you get much out of the document on that point?
Not very much, but I did get a feeling that we should, clearly the resolution says that China should be proud of being China, needs to be independent, needs to show its own path, and that it will, in a kind of colonial way, reach out to other people as well. So you can see that the model of economic reform, it's an old trope really, economic reform with not much political openness, would be attractive to many countries, particularly those that have entrenched elites, ruling classes, who don't want to share their political power. And that's still the case. Even without making jokes about liberal democracies who would like to be able to do the same. I do think, though, that there's a lot of Chinese nationalism in this document. Really is a lot of Chinese nationalism. And I think it would be naive to think that that didn't have an outward-facing, an outward-looking face, which could be uncomfortable for lots of people.
Yes, I think that's true. Let me stick with you for a second, David, before I come back to you, Ming. I mean, the way Kevin Rudd puts it, he says that Xi Jinping has gone to the left on economic policy and gone to the right on nationalism. Does that sound like a good way of describing it? You can be as frank as you like.
Is this for me or for Ming?
No, for David, for you. And then yes.
Yeah, I mean, as you probably can imagine, I'm not very keen on agreeing with Kevin Rudd, but yeah, it seems to me that's a simple way of expressing something which is going on. But I'm not sure he's really gone to the left on economics. I mean, I think he's caught here between the need to tap into the wealth that the private sector or the quasi-private sector, non-state sector is generating, but he needs the state sector, not least for government revenue. So sorting out the fiscal side of the political economy is really, really important. And there isn't much indication in here of that. The two things that have to change, I think, are the tax system and because having everything on purchase tax is not a good idea. It's very regressive, and especially if you're trying to reach some kind of common prosperity. And part of that would be household registration.
Yes, the tax system is a topic for another day, but it's certainly an underestimated topic. I think only about 10% of central revenues in China come from personal taxes, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. They have not learned how to tax people yet. Now, a question for you, Ming. Is there anything in this framework emphasizing legitimacy and a better future that reflects Xi's recent speech that China's behavior must become more attractive and less aggressive through wolf warrior diplomacy perceptions? So I think there was a speech by Xi Jinping about 6 months ago that China had to become cuter, I think was the word, 可爱. Did you see anything about cuteness in this document?
I don't have the impression this document actually touches upon this. I see a shaking head of David, so David must be agreeing with me. But I'm not surprised, right? Because this mentality of we as a nation have been victimized for decades, for more than a century, really is having a huge impact on how China now conducts external relations with other countries, and it's starting to backfire. So I do see, right? Xi Jinping not only just said China needs to be more 可爱 and 可靠, he also previously he said the Chinese need to tell the China story well, 讲好中国故事, which my interpretation is not the aggressive version of the China story that he wants the outside world to hear. But we'll have
more positive stories. Yeah. I might have a pet growling here in a second, but David, and we're getting to the end now. Another question from the audience, this one for you. In this document, is Xi's Taiwan solution any different, or anything different from previous leaders?
I don't believe so. I believe the party's been committed to the peaceful absorption of Taiwan for a long, long time, since about 1958, actually. For different reasons, of course, and in different contexts, but I can't see how a country which is dependent for a large part of its military technology on Taiwan is going to invade it.
Yes, so nothing there at all. Now what else? Let me see if I can grab one more question from the audience to finish. We talked about the length of the resolution. We had another question here. Does the resolution sound too positive for you? I guess that was inevitable in a sense, but she talks a lot about the founding mission and putting the founding mission back into history. Is there anything, is the founding mission being transformed in front of our eyes, or is it faithful to how it started? David, start with you, and then Ming, I'll go to you for the final word.
I find this a difficult one to even think about sensibly. I want to keep making jokes about it. I read in this document that the resolution that Marxism is not a dogma, it's a guide to action. And that strikes me as being very strange. I keep wondering to myself, what does Marxism mean if it's not about the role of the proletariat? And yet this is absent. So even the proletariat as newly defined in terms of workers and peasants, all the people, it just strikes me as being odd. The principal contradiction is now between about unbalanced development and the people's need for a better standard of living. No problem with that at all, but I don't understand how it relates to the original mission of the party.
Yes, you're right in terms of changes to pick up on the contradiction issue. That's important internally, I think. Ming, do you have something to say to close us out? We've got about a minute or even less left.
Okay, I'll be very quick. I think this document talks about 3 historical missions. The first had been achieved under Mao, which was the termination of the 100 years of humiliation. The second under Deng Xiaoping, which was economic development. Now is the start of the 3rd mission, which I think is subject to interpretation still, but I think national rejuvenation is a large part of it.
Okay, well, we're right on time now, so I'd like to thank you all. Hans Hendricks in absentia, I'm sorry we lost him. David Goodman and Ming Lu Chen and her 2 cats, who put on a great performance for the entire evening. Thanks for organising this, and I hope, expect this will be up on YouTube if people want to look at it later. It's Richard MacGregor from the Lowy Institute signing off from the Sydney University event.